The water was flat and gray the morning Nathaniel Odum fell asleep on the BC Ferries crossing from Tsawwassen to Swartz Bay, and nobody on that boat had any idea that the quiet man in seat 34, the one with the worn canvas bag on his lap and the daughter's drawing folded in his jacket pocket, had once guided Navy divers through pitch-black underwater passages off the coast of Halifax in seas that would turn most men's legs to water. He was not sleeping deeply. Men like Nathaniel never do. He was in that thin place between consciousness and memory, where the sounds around him, the low hum of the engines, the creak of the hull, the murmur of a family 3 rows ahead, folded themselves into older sounds, into the sound of a briefing room, into the sound of Commander Patricia Walsh saying, "Odum, you go first," into the sound of cold water closing over his head. His daughter Petra had made him promise before he left. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of making you feel like a fool for disagreeing with her. She'd stood at the door of his apartment in Nanaimo with her arms crossed and her chin tilted up, and she'd said, "Dad, promise me you're just going to sit there and read your book." He'd laughed. "I'm on a ferry, sweetheart. What exactly do you think is going to happen?" She had not laughed back. She'd just looked at him the way Claudette used to look at him before she got sick. That long, steady look that said, "I know you, I know what you do, I know what it costs." "Promise me," Petra said. So he promised. He always promised. The BC Ferries Spirit of Vancouver Island carried 412 passengers that morning, plus crew, plus 17 vehicles on the lower car deck. It was a Thursday in late October, which meant the summer crowds were long gone and the foot passengers were a quiet mix. Retirees heading to Victoria for the week, a few students with enormous backpacks, a couple of business travelers with laptops already open, a group of seniors from a church in Ladner who were loud about it in the way that church groups always are, filling the cafeteria with laughter before the boat had even cleared the dock. Nathaniel had taken a window seat in the forward passenger lounge. He'd bought a coffee at the counter, bad coffee, the kind that comes from a machine that hasn't been cleaned since the last federal election, and he'd opened his book, and within 20 minutes he had not read a single page because the engines were doing what engines always do to him, which is pull him down. He closed his eyes for just a moment. He dreamed about nothing, which was the best kind of dream. He woke up to a voice on the PA system that was working very hard to sound calm. The announcement was brief. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Chief Officer Sandra Voss." Nathaniel's eyes opened. He didn't move yet. He just listened. "We are currently experiencing a mechanical situation with one of our propulsion systems. There is no immediate danger to passengers. As a precaution, we are asking everyone to remain seated and to keep passageways clear. We appreciate your patience and will provide updates as they become available." The church group had gone quiet. A man 2 rows back said loudly, to no one in particular, "What kind of mechanical situation?" Nathaniel set his book down on the seat beside him and looked out the window. They were mid-crossing. The Strait of Georgia stretched out on all sides, flat and cold and absolutely indifferent. He could see from the angle of the shore in the distance and the way the horizon was holding that the boat was drifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but drifting, and the bow was swinging just slightly to port. The kind of thing most people would never notice. The kind of thing he noticed in his sleep. He picked his book back up. He was not going to get involved. He had promised. He read the same sentence 4 times. The sentence was, "The house had stood for 100 years and would stand for 100 more." He read it a 4th time and thought about Petra's face at the door of his apartment. He thought about Claudette in the hospital the last week, when she'd held his hand and said, "Nathaniel, you have to stop disappearing. She needs you here. She needs you whole." He thought about the year after the Navy, the year he'd spent driving a supply truck in Fort McMurray, because it was about as far from the ocean as a person could get in this country, because he'd needed to prove to himself that he could live a life that didn't require him to be useful in emergencies. He'd been doing fine. He'd really been doing fine. The boat shuddered. It was subtle, just a low vibration that moved up through the floor and into the seat and into the base of his spine, but it was wrong. He knew the difference between an engine running and an engine struggling, and what he'd just felt was an engine struggling. The PA clicked on again. Chief Officer Voss, still calm, still controlled, but the words were different this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently in contact with BC Ferries operations and with the Coast Guard. As a precaution, we are preparing the vessel for a possible extended drift situation. Crew members will be circulating to answer questions. Please remain calm and seated. Drift situation was not a phrase that belonged on a ferry announcement. Nathaniel set his book down again. He did not pick it up a third time. He found the chief officer on the bridge deck, which he was technically not supposed to access, but which he accessed anyway, because the crew member stationed at the door was a young man named, according to his name badge, Brendan, and Brendan was 22 years old and visibly frightened, and when Nathaniel said, "Calmly, son, I need to speak with the officer on duty," Brendan stepped aside without a word. Sandra Voss was 47 years old, with short red hair going silver at the temples and the kind of posture that comes from 15 years of keeping a vessel upright in heavy weather. She was on the radio when Nathaniel came through the door. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they don't have time for. "Sir, this area is restricted." "I know," Nathaniel said. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't rushing. He was just standing there in his jacket with the drawing in the pocket, with the same quiet that he'd learned to carry in rooms where noise was dangerous. "My name is Nathaniel Odum. I did 16 years in the Royal Canadian Navy. 5 of those years I was a clearance diver and navigation specialist. I've worked emergency propulsion on vessels in worse shape than this one." He paused. "I can see from your bow angle that you've lost your starboard pod. I'm guessing your port pod is running, but you've got limited steerage. I'm also guessing that if you look at the chart, you're starting to worry about Porlier Pass." Sandra Voss did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to the navigation chart spread on the console beside her. Then she turned back to Nathaniel. "How do you know about the pod?" "Because I can feel it," he said simply. Through the floor. She looked at him for a long moment. The radio crackled. Outside, the gray water held them both. "I don't know you," she said. "I have no way to verify anything you just told me." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "You don't." Another officer, younger, standing near the port side window, shifted his weight. His name badge said Kowalski, and he looked like he hadn't slept since Tuesday. "Chief, Coast Guard ETA is 45 minutes. Wind's picking up from the northwest. If we keep drifting at this rate—" "I know," Sandra said. She looked at Nathaniel again. He could see her doing the calculation. Not the navigation calculation, that one she'd already done, but the other one, the one about trust. About what it meant to hand part of your problem to a stranger on the basis of nothing but the way he carried himself. "If you're lying to me," she said quietly, "or if you're wrong, then we're in the same position we're in right now," Nathaniel said. "But I'm not wrong." He was not wrong. The Spirit of Vancouver Island had lost its starboard azopod, the rotating propulsion unit that gave the vessel both its thrust and its steering. At approximately 9:47 in the morning, the failure was not catastrophic. The pod had not fallen away from the hull. It had seized, locked at an angle of roughly 14 degrees to port, which meant that running the remaining engines at even power was causing the bow to pull steadily off course. The chief engineer, a woman named Renata Chernov, who'd been running engine rooms on BC Ferries vessels for 11 years, had already shut down the starboard pod to prevent heat damage. She was in the engine room when Nathaniel came down with Sandra Voss, and she looked at him with the clear professional suspicion of someone whose space has been entered by an uninvited person with opinions. "He says he can help us manage the drift," Sandra said. Renata looked at Nathaniel. "Can you?" "Tell me what your port pod is giving you right now," Nathaniel said. She told him. Thrust, RPM, the angle they had available, the restrictions. Nathaniel listened the way he used to listen to dive briefings, without interrupting, without nodding, without any expression at all, absorbing everything, arranging it. When she finished, he said, "You've got enough. If we run the port pod at asymmetric power, lower on the starboard side, and we use the bow thrusters in 15-second intervals rather than continuous, we can hold a modified course. It won't be straight. It'll feel wrong. But we can get her to active pass, and from active pass we can bring her in close enough to Galliano for a safe drift hold until the Coast Guard gets here." Renata was quiet for a moment. "That's not standard procedure," she said. "No," Nathaniel said. "It isn't. If it doesn't work, then we've lost 10 minutes, Nathaniel said. "But it will work." Sandra Voss looked at Renata. Renata looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at nothing in particular, which is what he'd learned to do in moments like this, because the men and women around him in those moments needed to feel that the person they were trusting was not frightened. He was, in fact, not frightened. He was something else, something close to the feeling he'd had in those underwater passages off Halifax in the dark, when everything outside his body was trying to disorient him and the only thing he could trust was what he knew, and what he knew was enough. "All right," Renata said. "Walk me through it." 43 minutes. That was how long it took. Nathaniel did not stand at a console and push buttons. That wasn't his role, and he knew it. He stood beside Renata Chernov and he talked, steady and quiet, and she translated what he said into engine commands. The Spirit of Vancouver Island moved through the Strait of Georgia like a car with a flat tire, pulling, listing, requiring constant correction, but moving. The bow thruster fired in 15-second bursts, each one a small correction that bled off the drift and brought them heading. The port pod ran at the asymmetric power curve Nathaniel had described, and the feel of it through the floor was wrong. Wrong in the specific way that a vessel feels when it's running outside its design parameters, but it was controlled wrong, purposeful wrong, wrong in the direction of safety. In the passenger lounge, 412 people sat in various states of comprehension. The seniors from Ladner had organized themselves. One of them, a man in his 70s named, according to the life jacket tag he'd tied to his lapel as a joke that no one laughed at. Douglas had begun moving through the rows, making sure that children had their life jackets ready and that the elderly passengers nearest the windows knew where the nearest muster station was. Nobody had told him to do this. He just did it, because some people are built that way. In the cafeteria, a young mother with 2 children under 5 years old was holding both of them in her lap and telling them, very quietly, a story about a seal who lived under the ferry and pushed it along with his nose when the engines got tired. The children believed her completely. On the bridge, Sandra Voss was on the radio with BC Ferries operations, her voice steady, her eyes moving between the chart and the windows, logging everything, because she understood that whatever happened next there would be an inquiry, and the log needed to be right. Nathaniel watched the headland of Galliano Island emerge from the gray and thought about Petra. She was at school right now, grade 4. She'd have no idea any of this was happening. She'd be doing, what did they do in grade 4? He was embarrassed that he didn't know exactly. He knew she liked math and hated gym and had 3 close friends and 1 complicated friend, and that she had recently become deeply interested in the migratory patterns of Pacific gray whales, for reasons that were not entirely clear to him, but which he supported without reservation, because that was the only rule he'd ever really followed consistently. "Support Petra heading," Renata said. Nathaniel exhaled slowly through his nose. "Yes," he said, "we are. The Coast Guard vessel rider class, the Murray Tyson out of Ganges Harbor, made contact at 11:22. By then, the Spirit of Vancouver Island was holding position 3 nautical miles off the eastern shore of Galliano, engines running at minimum power, drift managed. The wind had picked up to 18 knots from the northwest, which was uncomfortable but not dangerous. The passengers had been given an update by Sandra Voss herself, who had walked through the forward lounge and the cafeteria and the aft deck and spoken to people directly, clearly, without euphemism. They had lost an engine, they had managed the situation, the Coast Guard was here, they would be towed to Tsawwassen. Everyone was safe, she was sorry for the delay. The seniors from Ladner applauded. Sandra came back to the bridge deck and found Nathaniel standing by the port side window watching the Murray Tyson maneuver into position. She stood beside him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Yeah, I didn't want to," Nathaniel said. "Why?" He thought about how to answer that. "Because I promised my daughter I'd sit in my seat and read my book." Sandra looked at him. "Seriously?" "She worries," he said. "She's 9. Her mother died 2 years ago. She worries that I'm going to." He stopped. "She just worries." There was a long pause. Outside, the tow line was being thrown from the Murray Tyson, arcing across the gray water in a long, slow curve. "You kept your promise," Sandra said quietly. "You sat in your seat, you read your book, and then you came up here." "I read the same sentence 4 times, Nathaniel said. "What sentence?" "The house had stood for 100 years and would stand for 100 more. Sandra Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, Very unexpectedly, she laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that comes out of relief more than humor. And Nathaniel, who had not laughed in the presence of another adult since he couldn't remember when, laughed a little too. The inquiry took 3 months. Nathaniel gave his account to BC Ferries twice, to Transport Canada once, and to a marine safety investigator named Gerald Whitmore, who asked very precise questions and wrote down the answers in a notebook with a mechanical pencil. The findings, when they were published, noted that an off-duty passenger with relevant naval expertise had assisted crew in managing propulsion anomaly and drift. It did not name him. He had asked them not to. Renata Chernov sent him a card. It arrived at his apartment in Nanaimo 6 weeks after the crossing. It said on the front a picture of the ocean, and on the inside, in her neat engineer's handwriting, "You were right. It worked. Thank you." Below that, she'd added, "How did you know it would?" He wrote back. He wrote, "I didn't know, but I knew what would happen if we didn't try." Those felt like different things. He didn't hear from her again after that, but he kept the card. He put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept things that mattered. Claudette's last prescription, Petra's first school photo, his release documents from the Navy. Small pieces of a life that had been lived in portions, some of them painful, none of them wasted. Petra found out on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the crossing, from a classmate whose father had been following the Transport Canada preliminary release online. She came home from school and sat across from Nathaniel at the kitchen table and looked at him with her mother's eyes. "Zara's dad says there was a man on the ferry who helped them," she said. "He says the man was ex-Navy." Nathaniel was cutting an apple. He kept cutting. "Lots of people are ex-Navy," he said. Petra was quiet for a moment. She was 9 years old and she was not fooled by this. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Were you scared?" He put the nut down and looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of asking the question that cut straight to the middle of a thing, the question that everyone around her had been carefully avoiding. "No," he said, and then because she deserved better than half-truths. "Not the way you mean. I was concentrated. There's a difference." Petra thought about this seriously. "Like when I'm doing a hard math problem?" Exactly like that. She was quiet again. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the October light was going flat and gold over the rooftops of Nanaimo, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at nothing, and the world was the same size it had always been, which was both enormous and, in that specific kitchen, very small and very manageable. "You broke your promise," Petra said, not accusatory, just honest. Nathaniel picked up the apple slices and put them on a plate between them. "I know. But everyone went home," she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Everyone went home." Petra took an apple slice and bit it in half and chewed it thoughtfully. Then she said, "I think that's what the promise actually meant. Not that you wouldn't do anything. Just that you'd come home." She looked at him. "And you came home." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. He thought about Claudette in the hospital, saying she needs you here. She needs you whole. He thought about the sounds that water makes when it closes over you, and the silence underneath, and the feeling, not of danger, not of heroism, but of clarity, of knowing exactly what the next thing was. He thought about 412 people sitting in a passenger lounge above the Strait of Georgia, none of whom knew his name, all of whom had gone home. "Yeah," he said, "I came home." Petra finished her apple slice and reached across the table and covered his hand with her small one, and she didn't say anything else, because she didn't need to, because some things are understood in kitchens at the end of October, in a way they could never be understood anywhere else. What Nathaniel Odum never told anyone, not the investigators, not Renata Chernov, not even Petra, was the moment that had decided it for him. Not the sound of the announcement, not the drift he could see through the window, not even the calculation about Porlier Pass. It was the young mother in the cafeteria. He'd passed her on his way to the bridge deck. She'd been sitting against the wall with her 2 children in her lap, telling them the story about the seal. Her voice was so steady, so completely and deliberately calm, and her arms were so tight around those 2 kids, and her face above their heads showed something he recognized. Not fear, not courage exactly, but that particular expression that parents wear when they have decided that what they are feeling does not get to win today. When they have decided that the person they need to be right now is not the person who is afraid, but the person those children need. He recognized it because Claudette had worn it every single day of the last 8 months of her life. He'd walked past that woman and gone to the bridge deck, and he had not looked back, because if he'd looked back, he would not have been able to speak steadily to Sandra Voss, and he had needed to speak steadily. He'd done the math later, on the tow back to Tsawwassen, 412 passengers. At least 40 of them were children, maybe 60. That young mother's too were some of them. Douglas from the church group, with his self-appointed life jacket duty and his bad joke nobody laughed at. He was some of them. The students with the enormous backpacks who'd been trying to do readings on their laptops until the announcement. They were some of them. All of them had promises they were keeping. All of them were going somewhere. All of them had a kitchen somewhere where someone was waiting. He had not saved them. That was not how he thought about it, and it was not how it worked. Renata Tsernov had saved them. Sandra Voss had saved them. Brendan at the door of the bridge deck, who'd stepped aside on instinct, had saved them in his own small way. The Murray Tyson out of Ganges had saved them. The whole long chain of training and procedure and equipment, and yes, one retired clearance diver who'd fallen asleep in seat 34 with a book he didn't read and a daughter's drawing in his pocket. It had taken all of them. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moments that look like one person's story. They never are. They're always everyone's story, assembled quietly in the places you can't see, held together by more hands than you can count. He knew that. He'd always known that. He just sometimes forgot until something reminded him. And if you've ever felt the floor of a boat shift under your feet and thought, "Not on my watch," then you already know exactly what he means.